Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Freestyle Coding. In this video, we're going to be building not really a full application, but we're going to dabble in React and Redux. So if you don't know what React is, it's a JavaScript library for building UIs, okay, for building user interfaces or views, the part of the application that you see, okay. So it doesn't work with models or databases or anything like that, controllers. It's basically just for your view. And you can build UI applications with just React. You can use other libraries to do things like HTTP requests, to fetch data, and all that kind of stuff. But it's basically for UIs. Now, Redux is, this is the documentation here, but Redux is for managing your state, okay, your application state. For instance, if you have, let's say, a list of to-dos, that might be your index state. And then let's say you click the edit button next to one of the to-dos, that'll take you to your edit state. And you'd probably also store the current to-do that you're editing in that state. All right, so it's just that. It's a way to manage your application state. So React and Redux go together really well because Redux takes care of the state and takes care of any kind of API calls or interacting with databases, anything like that, and then it sends it down to React, which has different UI components that display on the web page. All right, and I'm not going to go through a whole spiel on the core concepts and any of that. I do have a course at eduonix.com on React and Redux if you want to check that out, if you want to learn more about how it works and what exactly they are. But I'm just going to kind of just move along and build this sample application. All right, so we're going to be using Webpack, which is a module bundler that'll allow us to install React and Redux, among other modules, using Npm. All right, our Node package modules. So you will need Node.js installed. If you don't have it installed, just go to nodejs.org and download it, install it. It's really simple. All right, and what we're going to do is we're going to fetch data using Redux. We're going to fetch it from this JSON placeholder service. Basically, it just gives us an API we can use for things like posts, comments, photos, to-dos. And you can see if I click on it, it's sending a GET request and it's returning all of these to-dos that we can bring into our application. All right, I'm going to do users for this tutorial. All right, so the idea is to make a request to this URL, bring these in using Redux, and then display them using React. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, to start out, we do need to set up a package.json file with all our dependencies, and to make that a little less work, I have this Webpack starter package that is available on GitHub, and basically you can see it's the package.json file. It has Webpack, it has the config file set up, and in the source folder you can see we have an app.js file which is blank, and then a simple index.html file. All right, so what we'll do is download this. So we'll click, let me just make this a little bigger. Okay, so we'll go ahead and download the zip file, which I already have, and then we'll create a new folder for the application on the desktop. And I'm just going to call this My Contacts. And no, I'm not going to call it that. I already have that. Let's just call it, we'll call it Our Contacts. Okay, for React or Redux. Now, what we're going to do is take that zip file. Let me just grab that. Okay, where is it? Right here, Webpack starter. Okay, so we're just going to take everything that is in here and bring it over to the Our Contacts folder. All right, now if we look at the GitHub page here, what we have to do is we have to run npm install to grab all the dependencies. But before we do that, we're going to just take a look at the files. So let's open up Sublime, and what I'm going to do is bring the project folder in here. So desktop, our contacts, select. Alright, so let's look at the package.json file. Alright, so this has obviously the name, version, and all that stuff, but the important part of this is the dependencies. Alright, so by default this package comes with the Axios or Axios, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but we're going to use that to make our GET request through our Redux file and get the users. Alright, now all these things here are all for Babel. Babel's going to be responsible for compiling the JSX in the React components, also allowing us to use the ES 2015 module syntax so we can import modules and files, and it also has a React preset. Alright, and then of course we have Webpack, which we're using for our module bundler, and then the dev server will allow us to actually run the server and application while we're working on it. Alright, now there are some things we need to add to this. You can see that we don't have React, we don't have Redux or any of that. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. Okay, so you just want to copy these here. So we have React itself, then we have React DOM. Now React has what's called a virtual DOM, which is basically its own smaller version of the DOM where it can update pieces at a time, so that we don't have to reload the whole page. We can just update certain components. And then we have React Redux, which is responsible for mixing the two, for binding React and Redux together. Then we have Redux itself. We have a couple pieces of Redux middleware. We have the logger, which was really helpful. It can tell us what's going on in the console. Promise middleware, so we can use asynchronous promises. And then Thunk, which allows us to use functions as our actions. Alright, and I'll explain that more later. So let's go ahead and save that, and then we're going to, before we run npm install, let's look at the Webpack config. So what this is doing here, we have an entry file of app.js, which is in the source folder here. This is basically the entry to our application. That's where we'll have to import everything. And then output, we're going to be compiling all of our JavaScript into the dist folder, which isn't created yet. If we run Webpack, it'll create it, and it'll compile everything into this one app.bundle.js file. And if we were to look at the index.html file, you can see that that's the only thing that we're actually including here. All right. Down here, we have all of our loaders. This is how we're going to use the Babel loader. Also the JSX, we want to be able to use JavaScript syntax extension in React, and then you can see we have the ES 2015 preset and React preset down here. Alright, so that's pretty much it as far as the Webpack starter goes. What we'll do now is open up a command line. Okay, if you're using Windows, you want to open the command prompt as administrator. And we'll go ahead and just navigate to that folder, which for me is going to be users/brad/desktop/our contacts. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and run npm install. Okay, that might take a minute or so. And while that's running, let's look at the Webpack starter page here. So you can see we can run the dev server with npm run server. Alright, now this is really important because you might get an error when you run this, as I will, because the port 8080 by default is being used on my machine. So if you want to change that, all you have to do is go to this file right here, this Webpack dev server file, and just change the two instances of 8080 to whatever you want. Okay, I suggest 8000. Alright, and then we can just simply run this and go to localhost 8000 or whatever your port is. Alright, and then to compile it into the app bundle file, you can just run Webpack. Alright, so it's a nice little package to start with. Alright, so now that that's done, we can go ahead and I'll try to run npm run server, and you can see what happens. Okay, so you can see I got this error. Okay, if you have this issue, then again just go into Node Modules, Webpack Dev Server, bin, and then that Webpack Dev Server JS file. And then down here where we have 8080, I'm going to change it to 8000. Also right here. And then we'll save it. Go back to the command line and we'll run it again. And now you can see that it's running on port 8000. So let's go ahead and go to that. We'll go localhost 8000. Okay, now there's no content here. You can see at the title bar it says Webpack Starter, and if we were to look at the source code, you can see it's that index file, and basically just has a div with the ID of app. All right, that's basically the placeholder for our main React component. All right, so let's go ahead and open up the console with F12. Make sure there's no errors, and now we're ready to start coding. Alright, so let's open up app.js to start with, and first thing we're going to do is import React. So import React from React, and then we're also going to need the React DOM. So we'll say import React DOM from React DOM. Alright, and then we're going to import our main app component. Okay, when you're working with React, you have a core app component just like you do in Angular 2. Now you don't need to do that, but it's really good practice. So we'll have this main app component, and then any other components will be nested inside of that. All right, and then our state and all that can go right at the top in that main app component. So that's going to be from /, and we'll have a folder called components and a file called app.js. All right, and then we can use our React DOM.render to render the component. Okay, so we'll pass in app component just like that, and then the next parameter we need to define where we want to stick this. Now remember, we have this div with the ID of app, so that's where we want to put it. So we're going to use document.getElementById and then pass in app. Save that. Alright, now it's going to give us an error because we don't have that file yet, that app.js. So let's create a folder inside the source folder called components, and we'll create a new file, and we're going to save it as app.js. And it's always a good idea to keep your component files with starting with a capital. All right, now in this file we're going to import React. And we're going to set up our component class. So export default class, it's going to be called app, and then we need to say extends react.component. Okay, so that's our main class. Now inside the component class is where we can put what's called a lifecycle methods, and there's a bunch of them, and they basically run at different points when your component's initialized or updated. All right, and there's only one that's required, and that's render. So we're going to go ahead and say render, and we're going to return. Okay, and you need to return a single element. Okay, it doesn't have to be a div, but it has to be just a single element, and then everything else has to be inside of that. All right, for now we're just going to say my app component. Okay, and we'll save that. And if we go over here, and let's see, we might have to restart the server. Yeah, let's go ahead and restart it. And there we go. Okay, so you can see now it's spitting out my app component. All right, now we're going to want to have a separate component for the contact list and for the the user list and the user itself. So what we'll do is in components, let's create another file and we'll save it as userlist.js, and we'll create another file and save that as just user.js. Alright, now what we'll do is in the main app component, we're going to put, let's see, user list, and that will embed that user list component into the app component. And in order to do that, we have to import it. So we're going to say import user list from /user list, and then let's copy everything we have in here and save it, and then inside user list we'll paste that in, get rid of that, and change this to user list, and we'll just say user list component and save it. And there we go. So you can see that that component is now embedded inside of the main app component. Alright, so now that we have that done, we want to start to bring in Redux, because we have nothing to do with Redux yet. Alright, so we're going to start with the entry file, which is app.js, and we're going to add a couple things here. So we're going to import what's called a provider, and that's going to be imported from React Redux. Alright, and then we also need the store. So we're going to say import store from ./store, which we'll create in a minute. Now this provider has to be wrapped around the main app component. So right here we're going to put in provider. Oops, I don't want to do that. And then on this side we'll say provider. Okay, now the store gets injected into the provider, so we can say store equals store, and that should be all we have to do in this file. So let's save it. Alright, so now what we need to do is create the store file. So right in the source folder on the same level as app.js, we're going to create store.js. Alright, and then in here we're going to import a couple things. So we're going to want to use what's called middleware, and we need to use apply middleware for that. Okay, we're going to use a logger middleware to let us know what's going on, and also middleware for promises, and then something called Redux thunk. Alright, but before we do that, let's also import create store. And those are both going to be from Redux. Alright, so now for the middleware, we're going to say import logger from Redux logger. And we want promise, and that's going to be from Redux promise middleware, and then import thunk from Redux thunk. Okay, then we need to also import our reducers. So I'm going to say reducer from, and we're going to create a folder called reducers. Alright, now a reducer is basically something that we're going to submit actions to, and that's where we can change our state. Alright, our state is basically going to be a single object, and we'll have different actions submitted to the reducer where we can do whatever it is we want to do. In our case, it's going to be to fetch data from an API and then return it. Alright, and we'll create those in a second. We also need a variable called middleware, and we're going to set that to that apply middleware, and then pass in promise. What else do we have? Thunk and logger. Okay, promise and logger should be a function, thunk should not. And then finally we just need to say export default create store, and then we simply pass in our reducer as well as the middleware. And that should be it. So let's save it. And now we're going to create a folder called reducers. And we're going to have a file called index.js. And then a file called we'll say users reducer.js. Alright, now let me see if I can explain this. So as I said, a reducer that's where we can modify our state and so on. But you can have a single reducer, or you can use what's called combined reducers, where you can split them up. Now, even though we're only going to have one single reducer, I'm still going to use the combined reducer just so we can scale the application if needed. All right, if we wanted to all of a sudden add to-dos, we could just simply plug in a to-dos reducer. All right, so that's why we have two files here. And now I'm going to start with the index. That's where we're going to include the combined reducer. So we'll say import combine reducers, and that'll be from Redux. And then we're going to import user from /users reducer. Alright, actually let's say users. And then we just need to export default combine reducers, and then we simply pass in an object with the different reducers. So in our case we just have the users. So let's go ahead and save that, and then go into the users reducer, and let's see, we're going to export default function, and all a reducer is a pure function. Okay, we're going to call this reducer, and it's going to take in two things. It's going to take in a state, so this is basically the initial state, which I'll set to an object, and then it's also going to take in an action. Okay, remember we submit actions to our reducer. Now as for the initial state, let's set users, and we'll set that to an empty array, and then we'll have, let's say, fetching, which will be set initially to false. We'll say fetched, set that to false, and then we'll have error, which will be set to null. Okay, so now down here we want to do a test. We want to test the different action types that are being submitted. Alright, so to do that you could use an if-else statement, but I prefer to use a switch. Okay, so we want to say switch, and what we want to test is action.type, and I'll show you, you'll see what this is in a minute. Alright, so what we want to do is set up a couple different cases here. So we're going to say fetch users, and what we'll do is return state. A shorthand way of doing that is with 3 dots and then state, and then also fetching, we're going to make that true. Alright, now the next case will be fetch users fulfilled. Okay, so this is going to run when our API is returning the data, okay, when it's fulfilled. So for that, let's copy this, and we want to set fetching to false, and then we want to set fetched to true. Alright, now since we're getting the data, we also have to include that. So let's say users, and we're going to assign that to action.payload. Okay, payload is the actual data that's being returned. And then we're going to have one final case, and that's going to be fetch users rejected. Basically, this is if we run into some kind of error, this will get called. Okay, so we'll return state, and then fetching will be false, and then we want to say error, and we're going to set that to the actual payload. Alright, and then finally after the switch we just want to return state, and that's it. So let's save that, and now what we'll do is create our actions file. So in our source folder we're going to create another folder called actions, and we're going to have one file in here, and we're going to call it users actions. Actually, we'll call it user action, or actions plural .js. Alright, now in here we want to first of all import that Axios utility. That's what we're going to use to make the actual GET request. And then we're going to export a function, and we're going to call it fetch users. Okay, and then we're going to say return function, and let's pass in dispatch, and we'll say axios.get, and then we need the URL, which is this right here. Copy that. Alright, and we're using promises here, so we're going to want to say .then, and in here we're going to pass in a set of parentheses with response, and then we'll point that to a code block, and in here we're going to run dispatch. Okay, so this is all happening asynchronously, and then we'll pass in an object, and that's where we include the type. Alright, so we're going to say type. It's going to be fetch users fulfilled, and then we send the payload, and that's going to be the response.data. Alright, so remember, this probably looks familiar to you, the type and the payload. Alright, if we look in the reducer, the type is what we're actually testing. So in this case it's going to be the users fulfilled, and the payload is what is going to be the actual data. Alright, so hopefully that kind of clicks and makes sense. I know it might be a little overwhelming if you've never worked with Redux before or any of this stuff, but it's actually not that hard once you kind of get the hang of it. Alright, now we're also going to do .catch right here in case there's any errors. So here we'll pass in error, set that to a code block, and let's copy this. This time we're going to call fetch users rejected, and we're going to send the payload, which is going to be the error itself. Alright, and remember when we did the reducer we have the rejected, and you can see error is the actual payload that we're sending. Alright, so hopefully that makes sense. And that's it for that file. So let's save it. And now everything with Redux is pretty much all set. Now we need to bring it into our React component. So let's go to Components, App.js, and we're going to need to bring a couple things in here. Okay, so we need to import what's called connect, and this is just that, it helps connect Redux to React. Alright, and then this is going to use what's called a decorator, so we're going to say @connect, and we're going to pass in here another set of parentheses and store. Set that like that, and then we're going to say return users, and that's going to equal store.users.users. Alright, now the reason that we have this twice is because if we look in, let's see, if we look in index, our user reducer we're importing as users, and then if we look in the actual reducer we also have this array called users, so that's why we're putting that in twice. Alright, now what we'll do is we need to go down here and add another lifecycle method because we want this to run. We want the fetch users function that we created to run before the render. So we're going to use a lifecycle method called component will mount. Alright, and then before we can actually use the fetch users function, we have to import it. So up here we're going to say import fetch users from, and we want to say // actions / user, what is it, user actions. Alright, so then down here we should be able to do this .props .dispatch and pass in that fetch users. Alright, so now what this does is it now gives us a property for the users. So down here in the render, we can now say this .props .users. Alright, and what this whole connect thing does is takes your state and puts it into a React property that you can then use in your components. Alright, so what we'll do is just pass that into our user list. So right here we're going to say users equals this .props .users. Alright, and just to test this out, let's go ahead and do a console log of that. This .props .users, save it. Alright, now down here, this stuff you see right here is coming from that logger middleware that we included. So you can see that fetch users fulfilled is being called, and the payload includes an array with 10 elements in it. And if we look at one of these, you can see it's the first user, Leanne Graham, which if we look at the API results is Leanne Graham. So that's fetching data. Alright, and then what we did right here, the console log. Now this is a little confusing, but I'm going to try to explain it. You see how we have this empty array and then we have the array full of the objects? The reason this is happening is because with React, when you call this component will mount, it makes it render twice. So this is being run twice. Now the first time it renders is before we actually get the users. So it's giving us the initial state with it, which is a blank array. And then after it runs, it renders again and it includes all of the objects. Alright, so what we need to do is in this user list, we have to check and see, we have to make sure that there's actually stuff in this array before we actually render the component, because if we don't, it's going to give us an error. Alright, so what I'm going to do is just get rid of that, and then we're going to go into user list, and let's go in the render, but above the return, and we're going to do an if statement. We're going to say if object dot get own property ID, get own property names, and then we'll pass in this dot props dot users, and then we're going to check the length and see if it's equal to 0. Alright, if it's equal to 0, that means that there's nothing in the array. So what we'll want to do is just return, we'll return just an empty div. Alright, so once we do that, we can then move on and fetch our users and put them, we're going to use what's called a map function to iterate through them. Alright, because we want to take that array, we want to iterate through it, and then spit out one by one the users. So right here what we'll do is create a variable, we'll call it user nodes, and let's set it to this dot props dot users, and then we're going to call dot map. All right, and then inside map, we're going to have a function. And we need to specify what we want to call each individual user, which of course we'll just say user. And then we're going to return. We're going to return, and then this is where we're going to include our our user component. So user, and that's going to come from this user.js component, which we haven't created yet. But what we're going to do is say user. Let's pass in the name. So we'll set that to user.name. And we'll pass in the email. User.email. And let's pass in a key. And we'll set that to user.id. Alright, and these are all coming from, if you look at the API results here, we have an ID, name, email. You have some other stuff too, but I'm going to try to keep this short. Alright, so then we need our closing user tag, and then in here we're just going to say user.name. Okay, and then down here let's put an H1, we'll say users, and then we can say user nodes. Okay, so what this is doing is it's trying to render a component called user. So if we go and we reload, let's see, I would think it would give us an error. Oh, right here. So it's saying user not defined. Okay, so what we need to do is create that user component. So I'm just going to copy what we have in here, paste it in user, change that to user, and then get rid of all this. We don't need any of that. And then in here we can render whatever we want from the user. So let's say this dot props dot name. Okay, remember we passed in the name right here, so that means we have access to it using this dot props and then whatever this. So name, we also have access to email and key. So let's save that, and then in order to use this we have to import user. So import user from user. Save that. And there we go. So now we're printing out all of those users from that user state. Alright, we should also be able to put the email. So if we go to our user component, and we'll just put a dash, and then we'll say this dot props dot email, save, and now you can see we're getting their emails. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and hopefully this gives you an idea of how React and Redux work together and how you could start to build a real application with it. And if this stuff interests you, I do have other React videos on my channel, and I also have courses available at edgeonix.com, which I'll try to put in the description. Alright, so I may take this further later on, I'm not sure. I may add to it. But I don't know. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this and learned a little something, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.